Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. We're going to give it a little bit as the room fills up. Thank you so much for showing up today. Um, this is an exciting time because we get to have a conversation that I haven't really seen happen around, the pastors and churches and things like that, like this sort of conversation. And so just would love to introduce to you guys some of our panelists that are coming up. I'm seeing now the room filling up, so I'll give it a minute. But just this idea of the state of Asian American pastors in non-Asian churches. And so it's a very sort of specific setting. So I'm very excited about this conversation that we're going to be having today. Thanks so much, Caleb and Eugene, Felicia, Fiel, James, Jane, Caitlin, Leilani, Megan, Patricia, Paul, Priscilla, Shula, Taylor. Good to see you. I think I know a few of you. Um, just so encouraging to see more and more people showing up. We're going to give it a minute before we get started, but would love to just have you say hi in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. And there will also be a period of time of Q&A directly with our panelists. And so definitely, as you're engaging, feel free to drop that question in the chat, and our hosts will actually be gathering those questions and be saving them for the Q&A period of time. And so, yeah, so grateful that you guys would show up and be here. Let me go ahead and actually start with, by way of introduction, I would love to hear from all three of our panelists. Just simple introductions, right? Your name, your title at your church. Tell us about your church and your journey, maybe a little bit about your journey to working at a non-Asian church. So why don't we begin with who's on my upper left, Sherin.
Hi, so I'm Sherin Swift, Sherin Matthew Swift, and I'm the pastor of Connections and Equipping at New Life Fellowship Church, which is a highly multi-ethnic church in Elmhurst, Queens. And prior to that, I was serving as a pastor of spiritual formation at New York Covenant Church, which was a primarily Black church. So a couple of diverse settings that were non-Asian church settings.
That's great. And so tell us a little bit about that journey to working. Like, how did you grow up and where did you end up? Like, how did you end up going into this Black church and now very multi-ethnic church?
So I grew up actually outside of the church, even though my extended family was very much Christians going back many generations in India. And so my father raised us as atheists. So it took me a while to find my way to church. And when I did become a Christian, it was at a predominantly white church. And so it was a struggle for me to see where I fit.
Yeah.
And I also was at a church that was complementarian. So it was not a place where I could use my gifts. So that was doubly confusing.
Yeah.
So I had a career in accounting for a long time before I made this shift. And I found myself as a member at a covenant church where women were encouraged to fill all kinds of roles. And I found that the encouragement to step up and use my gifts and to have folks discern with me. And so it was really at that Black church at New York Covenant where I was really accepted and called out as a pastor and really engaged my training, ordination. And so a lot of gifts were received there, and that's what really launched me into ministry. So yeah, I was very
Oh, that's
fortunate.
great.
Yeah.
That's great. Speaking of women at a covenant church, we turn to Phyllis.
Hi. Thanks, Richard. My story is kind of similar actually to Sharon's in the sense that I was just a member of a church and doing other things and working a different job. And then kind of, was able to see women leading in ministry and kind of came in through that way. But my name is Phyllis, and I am a next gen pastor right outside of Boston at a church which we now call Great Road Church. It was formerly Highrock Acton. And it's a predominantly white suburban church that I serve at, and I am the only person of color on staff as well. So that's where I'm hailing from.
Now, Phyllis, who is next gen? Because for me, that's like a 38-year-old. So who's next gen for you and for your church?
So the way that we define next gen at our church is anyone from birth all the way on up to high school, but we have some college students who are still in the area or living at home throughout the pandemic. So we've kind of folded them into that. So it's all those kids plus their families.
Great. Okay, I understand. And I'll tell the audience two things are true. For fact number one is not all Asians know each other. Fact number two is Phyllis and I have actually known each other for many, many years, going
Many
back
years.
to times when we had young kids, and we're serving at the same church. Clark, I turn to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey guys, you may be wondering, why is there a white dude on this call? So I'm actually half Korean, half white. I was born and raised in San Francisco, where I grew up and where I'm serving now. Um, Similar to Sherin, I didn't grow up in the church. I was born and raised to artist, musician parents who were non-Christian. But growing up in San Francisco, being biracial, I always grew up around, a mix of ethnicities. I grew up in a predominantly Black neighborhood. And then I went to predominantly Chinese American schools because most Asians in San Francisco are Chinese. So I actually came to faith through some friends at my school that were Chinese American, and they brought me to their Chinese immigrant church. And that's where I was saved. And so I spent all of my faith journey was through the Asian immigrant, Asian American church. I went on to work at a Korean immigrant church and then a Korean American church, and then came back to San Francisco and worked at that same Chinese immigrant church that I was saved in. And now I'm where I'm at, which is First Baptist Church in San Francisco, part of the SBC. And I'm the associate pastor. So I oversee youth, college young adult, small groups, and discipleship ministries. The church is really unique in that it was the first Protestant church in California. It's 173 years old. So it
Wow.
was predominantly white American up until probably 50 years ago. There was a shift in the city, and as the city grew, our church is in the heart of the city right now. But back then, that was like the outskirts where they planted. And so it's very multicultural. There's probably not a single majority ethnicity in the congregation. And I have the privilege of, there's 7 of us on staff, and we are exactly half Asian, half white, because I'm half. So half the staff are white, half the staff are mixed Asian, Indian, Filipino, and myself. So it's an interesting and fun context to work in, and very different. I've only been at my church for about 8 months now, so very different from anything I've done in the past.
Yeah, oh, great. Well, Clark, you'll be able to give us the comparative perspective of working in Asian churches and non-Asian churches.
Yeah.
But I wanted to start out and just ask, what would you say have been some of the challenges that you've encountered as an Asian pastor working in a non-Asian context? And I just encourage our audience, if you are resonating with something that somebody says on the panel, feel free to let them know in the chat. And then also a reminder that we will have a time for Q&A. And so feel free to drop your questions as they come into the chat, and our host will actually gather the questions for us and give it to us at the end. Phyllis, why don't we start with you? What have been some of the challenges?
Oh, sure. As I was thinking about this, I was just there's a lot that come to mind in terms of challenges. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've faced is not being recognized as Asian American. I don't know if that makes total sense, but I think there's a sense of, color blindness, but then on top of that, there's this, uh, I guess what I've heard a lot is people say to me, "Oh, I don't consider you to be Asian. I just kind of see you as white." And I have to remind them that I am not indeed white, but I am Asian. And I think, the pandemic kind of heightened that for me personally. And that stark difference just was much more pronounced for me. And I think that that's always a surprise, especially in my context. And I think the other challenge that I face is kind of understanding my context. There's some things that I have to explain a lot because I come from a particular, I'm a Korean American and my parents are immigrants. And, I had one foot in Korea and one foot here in the United States. And there's just some things that kind of terms, like the way we think about things, that are just different. And if I have to explain the backstory for everything all the time, it just takes a lot of time. And I can see that people get the glazed eye look and they're just like, I don't want to hear about like why you use the dishwasher as a drying rack rather than as a dishwasher, and all of that kind of stuff. And I've used the terms like Han and Chung, which are uniquely Korean terms, and then to try to explain that, because they don't necessarily have English equivalents, but to try to explain those things and kind of everything that kind of surrounds it so that they understand the meaning in a deep sense, is just, that's a huge challenge. And then I think the other thing is, for me, it's been finding fellow colleagues, especially pastors who are women of color, particularly Asian Americans, who are serving in churches. So I would say those are probably the three big challenges that I have faced being in a non-Asian church.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that. Clark, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm grateful for my church being as diverse as it is. There's probably a lot less explaining I have to do, thankfully. I think because I'm also newer to my church, and I spent 12 years ministering in Asian immigrant and Asian American churches. What I've found is the main challenges are actually just like I can't assume things. Whereas before, there was this general assumption that when I'm working with Chinese Americans or Korean Americans, there's just certain cultural things you can assume that factor into how we do ministry. Now, myself not being Chinese American, not being fully Korean, I've always had to be a cultural learner. I've always kind of been on the outside, but at least ministering to those people, there was definitely a sense of like comfort and familiarity. Now in my multi-ethnic church, I just can't assume that. And so I think while it is a challenge, I think it's one that's really been beneficial to me. It's really helped me grow in my own cultural competence and awareness. But I do miss some of those comforts. My wife and I will talk about it with our family sometimes. Like we do kind of miss that there's some of those things specific to Asian culture that we can't assume and probably can't get anymore because we're no longer in the Asian church. Things like just how family oriented Asian churches tend to be. Especially where where my wife comes from in a Korean church, where we came from, there's very close-knit family there, even more so than the Chinese church we were in. And even just relating on cultural terms, like there's just a lack of cultural familiarity and awareness and even sensitivity as we're interacting with people in the church, because it's just case by case now. And so I would say those are challenges, but I don't think they're negative. I think they're unique to where we're at. And so I am grateful for the challenges we get to face, but I miss it sometimes, to be honest, when I think back, as much as I love where I'm at now.
Yeah, when you go to a very, very diverse church where, many different cultures are represented, it's almost like everybody has to do the work.
Right.
Whereas it's, in a predominantly white church, a predominantly Black church, a predominantly Asian church, the people that are majority culture don't have to do the work, because
Right.
if just you put your shoulders down, you relax, sit back in your chair, because it feels sort of accessible and natural.
Mm-hmm.
Sherin, I know you go to a very, very diverse church, maybe the most diverse church in America, and would love to just hear your experience of some of the challenges as well.
It's interesting. It's still a challenge at certain points. I find that sometimes congregants want to just, and this is similar to what Phyllis was just saying, they want to cast you in a light as similar to them, right? And so I've had white people also say to me like, well, I think of you as, I literally have actually had that said to me, like, well, you count as a white person, like, because they think of Black and white. And I've also had, that's not that's not typical at New Life. I do want to say that, but also I've had, other people of color just sort of not really see me, or not see some of the distinctions of who I am. I have people make assumptions, even other Asian folks make assumptions about my own connection to my culture. And, because of my dad raising us outside of the Indian church, I didn't have huge connections to my culture. I had some to my cousins and aunts and stuff. So there's a gap there for me that I've taken time to really try to fill and connect. But sometimes folks make a lot of assumptions about, even within other Asian cultures, about like my connection to my broader culture, or my home country, or my mother tongue, that I sometimes find challenging, because then I have to say, oh, actually for me, my experience was different. And so it can get complicated even with across the Asian diaspora. But also, people are so quick to jump to their own connection to your culture, so when they do ask me who I am, and where I'm from, or where my family is from, because sometimes in a multi-ethnic space, people might assume that I'm Guyanese or part of another part of the Indian diaspora. So when I explain that my parents immigrated from India, they often want to jump to their own connection to my culture without, again, really hearing my story. And I think that can be hard. It's like, oh, I love Indian food. It's like, well, the Indian food you probably eat in a restaurant is probably North Indian. It probably has very little to do with the food I grew up eating, or, so some of that can still be complicated. It's like, it's more complicated than I think people want to assume or guess, especially non-Asian people. And so, because there's the layers of our own culture, our countries have a lot of variety and diversity, even within their borders. And then on top of that, we have really unique immigration stories. Some have had families here for generations, and others newly immigrated. And so I think a lot of it is just the assumption that there's kind of one thing that connects us, and even in a multicultural or multi-ethnic space, that's still a challenge.
Yeah. You had mentioned really not growing up in an Indian church context. So I'd ask Phyllis and Clark. Clark, I know you worked within an Asian context, but Phyllis, did you grow up in a Korean church context? And if you did, now working at a non-Asian church, is there a sense of like, understanding the difference as either like, oh, I'm getting away from, like, I want to run from and escape from the culture of my, heritage church, or is it a sense of like guilt about leaving it behind? And then Clark, I will go to you for the same question.
Yeah, so I grew up in a Korean immigrant church where we had an English ministry, which I think is very common in immigrant churches. And I was at a predominantly Asian church for a while before I came into my current context. And I have to say, I don't know if it was so much of a running away, but I think I was deeply hurt and wounded by uh, the Asian American church, or the Korean American church in particular. And so I just wanted something different and new, and somewhere where there wasn't a high concentration of Korean Americans in a church building, um, which is why I kind of ended up at the church that I was at originally, and then realized that it was actually, there were a lot of Asian Americans at that church. Um, and I don't feel guilt necessarily, but I do feel that I was sort of running away in some ways to try to find something different.
Yeah.
Not because I wanted to escape it. I think there was a lot of wonderful and valuable things, and I kind of miss like the fact that they have Korean food after church service, and just kind of some of those things, or that I hear Korean being spoken, and just some of those kinds of things I miss. But I think for me, what it really was about was just trying to see if there was something different, or if there was a way to kind of repair and heal from wounds that I had received from, the Korean immigrant church kind of experience. And if church in general was different from that experience, like, is white church different? Is a non-Asian church different? I don't know. So part of it is like, I got to explore and figure that out.
Yeah. So what were some of the differences that you noticed?
Well, like we sing really similar songs. So I think I think that was the biggest thing that I realized was that there is a westernization of even immigrant church that I was not aware of until I came out of it. And then I'm looking back and I was like, whoa, like we are very similar still to kind of what westernized church looks like, or Western church here in the United States looks like. I think that's like the biggest thing. I think the other thing is the people who just surround you. Um, my church is predominantly white, and it's we have a handful of Korean Americans or Asian Americans and Black Americans and so forth, and Latinos who are at our church. But you could count us on like two hands, maybe. And so uh, it's just the culture of the church is just different when you have, I think, that kind of ethnic makeup and the majority is of a certain way. Um, yeah, so.
Yeah, that's great. Clark, how about for you?
Yeah, I thought about this question over the course of my time in the multi-ethnic church. Like, did I escape? Was I just running away? And there was a lot of process for me when I left my previous church because I'd only ever been a part of Asian American churches. And I think that was a big process for me. And even just asking, like, am I just trying to get out? I had a bunch of friends in seminary who were all Asian American. And we'd always kind of joke, like, those who got out of the Asian church were the ones who made it. Like, they
Yeah.
made it to greener pastures, because
Yeah.
we all knew just how marred the immigrant church especially was by trauma, generational trauma, things our parents and grandparents generations went through, and how that heavily affected leadership in the church and health. And so we always kind of longed for the healthy church, which always seemed white dominant.
Hmm.
And for me, uniquely being biracial, I think I never quite felt at home at the Asian church. And so I knew eventually I was going to have to make a shift out of the Asian church into a multi-ethnic church. I just kind of knew that was in my future. But even though I knew that, and even though I knew this was the right move, there was definitely a sense of I'm just escaping the reality of what was hard, and with that was some guilt of like, am I leaving behind and not helping to grow the church that I grew to love, even though I didn't grow up in it, even though I don't necessarily have ties to it personally, I don't have skin in the game. But I think what I've just come to find is that there are, as I've talked with other friends, for myself, as I'm processing and talking with other friends, we all have different roles to play when it comes to the global church, and we can all some of us can take more things than others. Some of us can deal with different situations than others. And I think I just kind of had to come to the realization that, I'm not going to be, even though my name is Clark, I'm not going to be the Superman for the Asian church. Like, I can't be the one who solves the problems of the Asian church. And a lot of that is just because I had to finally also realize, because I'm not fully Asian immigrant, there were just nuances and things that were harder for me to deal with than some of my friends that grew up in the church maybe and understood the nuances more. And so I think that really helped me realize, like, the way God has uniquely made and crafted and gifted me, how can I maybe have better service in a different role? And so what I've come to find is, in my time now, I've really become kind of like this bridge builder between white majority and the people of color in our church, and just helping our staff, our pastors, our leadership, just navigate some of those cultural divides and issues when they come up. And that's just, I had to realize, like, that's going to be my role. I might not be the one who really rides it to the end with the immigrant church or with the Asian American churches, but I still have like a lot of affinity and love for the Asian church. I still do a lot of work with one of my other jobs. I work for an organization that helps to resource Asian and Asian immigrant churches. So I still feel very invested in it because of just so much of my formation and my story.
Yeah, I know this is not what everyone signed up for, but as a moderator also have an experience of leaving an Asian church going to a non-Asian church. So I'll just ask myself. But yes, actually, it's a very it really kind of gets at the core of your identity to say, sort of like, am I trying to leave who I am, or am I trying to escape in order to become, who I can be? All of these different thoughts and feelings. And I think ultimately I wrestled with that while I was at the Asian church, even though we were trying to become more multi-ethnic. And I feel like at the moment where I finally decided to leave, it was recognizing that the congregation was, um, I think, more content being an ethnically dominant church and community and finding strength and purpose in that. And I felt like increasingly that was becoming different than my sort of lived expression of my faith. And so I needed to be able to leave in a way that didn't, sort of downplay or put down the people that wanted to stay in that sort of context, because I don't think there's anything wrong with it. There was just a dissonance that was sort of growing in my faith expression for that. And so it's definitely difficult sort of leaving and wanting to be able to have a more authentic expression of my faith while also valuing their sort of expression of faith within their context and community. And I know for a fact, actually, I know that there were people that were in that community that felt like I was leaving, like I was betraying them. I was, definitely, you know, uh, making them feel like I was leaving them behind in so to speak. I think Clark, what you had talked about sort of making it in the predominantly white church.
Yeah,
Ri
I would.
Richard, could I? Oh,
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think I have a lot of friends who since seminary have done the same thing. They
yeah,
just felt their faith convictions had led them to want to move beyond a monolithic or ethnic specific church, and they've gone through the same wrestlings. But I think we're
yeah,
seeing more and more of that, as this topic's about the state of Asian pastors and non-Asian churches. I think we're just seeing more of that, and there's other challenges like we're going to talk about that come with it. But I just wonder how many other Asian pastors are feeling some of the same thing.
yeah,
And some of that guilt is also preventing them from leaving their churches, because they feel like there's this, like in Asian culture, we have such a dominant filial piety, like an obligation, that to leave the church is to leave behind our culture and our filial obligation.
yeah.
I
Phyllis?
just, yeah, I just wanted to add in there the other component I think that maybe we might want to consider is that, for me personally, I had a lot of self-hatred for my culture and for my
Mm,
ethnicity. And I think that has played a much larger role than I would have wanted or thought it would have played in my decision of going elsewhere. But as I have been in this predominantly white context, what I've noticed is that I then sort of lost a sense of like who I was. And so it has been a wrestling of trying to figure out, okay, who am I without this Korean immigrant church that's behind me? Because my identity was so much of this group identity. And now I'm trying to forge my own identity, which has connections to this group, but that is no longer surrounding me all the time. And so the question that I see myself asking a lot these days is, okay, who am I? And what's important about like my own ethnicity? And how does that intersect with my faith? And what does that mean for me as somebody who is ministering in this context and ministering in other contexts? So I feel like that's just another kind of added thing in there with what both you and Clark were saying.
yeah, and I just want to say a word of comfort, to the people that are attending now or maybe watching this on the recording. I'm 46 years old, right? And in some ways, when I was growing up in pastoral ministry, like, of course I thought that the white church was making it, right? And like so if you feel like that, I don't blame you for making a career decision or a life decision based off of that information, because like when I was growing up in pastoral ministry, like of course that's what I thought. When I looked at who was writing the articles, who was speaking at the conferences, who was leading the denominations, they were all white. And so, of course, there was a naturally embedded value around that, that I think, is in some ways inescapable, and I think needs to sort of be parsed and work through. But I think that what Phyllis, what you are exactly talking about, like who are we and what do we bring, regardless of whatever context we're in, because we're not only Asian, right? We bring so many things to the table. And so I would say whatever context you're in, to bring your full self in those ways to whatever context you're in is really the best pastor and best sister, best brother in Christ that we can be. I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to ask you this. So NBC Asian America wrote an article last year in which AACC, Asian American Christian Collaborative, was featured. And they reported that, quote, Asian American Christians from a range of denominations have been calling on churches to fight racism in their own pews. Now, while some of these efforts have been embraced, others have faced opposition. So Sherin, why don't we start with you? How did you respond to the racial reckoning of these last couple of years, and specifically to the recent rise of anti-Asian hatred here in America? And did you feel like empowered to speak up? Did you feel supported by the church? And how was the church's response?
It's interesting, and this partly connects to what we were just talking about sort of how even Asian spaces are so shaped by kind of white culture, like the songs we sing and stuff. And having come up in ministry at a predominantly Black church, it's interesting now being in a multi-ethnic space and seeing some of those lines kind of drawn, and how colonialism and things like that have shaped, like what songs we choose to sing or attempt to sing as a congregation and things like that. And so when this all happened, having come kind of been raised up in ministry in a Black church space, kind of speaking up about, George Floyd, the anniversary just passed, some of these really pivotal moments, Maud Avery, all these things happening, it felt natural to, as the Black church says, pray with your feet, that it made sense that we would protest. And thankfully New Life is a place where, that could be talked about and organized as a church, but it was interesting as the rise in anti-Asian violence started to really get public attention, and people were starting to draw attention to this pattern, that it wasn't just a couple of isolated incidences, but this is like really a movement, a destructive movement that we're seeing. We started to realize that, we had done work, a few of us as Asian pastors, and, I was thinking of myself in particular, has done a lot of work about combating anti-Blackness and, things like the model minority myth that sort of undergird anti-Blackness. But we started to realize, as people in our congregation were hurting, our Asian brothers and sisters were hurting, that we really didn't the conversation was still centered around kind of Black and white, and we hadn't really found ways to effectively center Asian voices and our stories. And now that there was pain, especially like after the Atlanta shootings, it just became really clear, like, we don't even know our own stories, a few of us, there are a couple of us who are Asian pastors on staff, got together and we started talking about doing a panel discussion. And we realized we didn't even know each other's stories, that we so often don't even share amongst ourselves. We're so busy trying to meet the needs of others and kind of, combat some of the larger racial narrative of like, other people groups, that we often didn't even know each other's stories. We didn't know who immigrated when, who was born overseas, who was born in the US, like who, we knew where, whether we were Korean or Chinese or Indian, we knew that, but we didn't even know each other's stories. And so we really found that we needed to address that. We just needed to have spaces where those stories were shared. And we're still wrestling with how do we have some of these conversations that don't center, white voices or necessarily like the point of view, or don't necessarily cater to a white audience, but actually centers people of color, where, there are Asian voices being heard, Latinx voices being heard, Black voices being heard. And yes, of course, white people are more than welcome to be a part of the discussion, but it's not, they're not our primary audience, if that makes sense. And I think some of that, the rise in anti-Asian violence has kind of brought that to the forefront, that like there's a discussion to be had that doesn't have to center on, you know, our white congregation, white members, but it can actually center on the people of color, and we can bring our white congregants along with it, but we can kind of have this larger discussion. And so that's some of what we're exploring now, is what would that look like? And how do we start building those conversations in a way that, you know, everyone is really included, the stories are being heard, but it's not centered around like one point of view necessarily, if that makes sense. And I think for us, that was a big multi-ethnic sort of awakening for us, is that even inadvertently, we were still sort of centering that one point of view, and not doing enough to maybe center other ways of having this discussion. So it's something we're still continuing to explore. What does that look like? Yeah,
that's great. Clark, how about you?
Yeah, I think I can probably answer from both sides, because I was at the Asian church when the pandemic hit and all the racism, anti-Asian and anti-Black were happening. When it first started with George Floyd, there was this rupturing of the church needs to do something. What I found was that many people in Asian churches were hesitant, at least in my church and a lot of my friends in their Asian churches. I think a lot of that was because of their own racial biases and their own inherent, implicit prejudices because of what they've experienced at the hands of Black people in the past, or what they've been fed by modern media. So there's a lot of hesitancy to get involved in these social issues. And there's a lot of nuances, right? I think a lot of Asian churches tend to be more conservative, and so you also had the rhetoric of the right saying, well, just preach the gospel, don't worry about social issues. So that's also being fed into the Asian narrative as well, being a generally culturally conservative culture. And so what I just found was, and so much you were sharing earlier, Richard, like the desire for social action married to faith, for a gospel that compels action. I just found that in the Asian church, it was really hard to advocate for that and do that. There was a group of us that, we did plan a march in our city with other churches, and we did it. But a lot of our members in our church were like, why do we keep talking about this? Like, why are we talking about it? And something I've talked a lot about when it comes to this whole topic is this idea in moral philosophy called moral proximity. And it's the idea that the more proximate you are to something, the higher morality, the higher value it has for you morally. So if we are more proximate to people of color or Black people or Asians, when we see acts of injustice against them, we'll have a greater sense of moral obligation and responsibility. And what I found in the Asian church is that there simply weren't there weren't many people proximate physically or emotionally to the Black community. And so that lack of proximity also created a lack of moral care, moral obligation. But that's a problem, right? Because then we're only going to care about the things that we're proximate to. I think that's part of the reason why, abortion tends to be the one thing that the right champions, because they are morally disproximate or non-proximate to other groups. So that was actually something that compelled me to leave the Asian church, because my wife and I just felt this burning desire, like, we can't just sit on the sidelines anymore. We can't just let this stuff happen without doing something. On the flip side now, being in the multi-ethnic church, what I found is that you would assume that because there's all these, kind of what Sherin was saying, because there's all these people represented, you would assume that the natural reaction is, well, we're going to care about everything because everyone's in that community. But I've also found that that's not the case. It's not automatic. There's been quite a few times where I've been sitting in my church or in my staff meetings wondering, like, are we going to address something like this elderly woman in New York was just murdered? Are we going to address that? And no one's talking about it, because I just realized we're listening to different news. We're watching and listening to different news outlets. I'm more keen and aware of things that they're not because of my moral proximity being Asian. And so what I found is in the past, where maybe I would just kind of look around like, well, who's going to speak up and do something? Well, now I'm the person that has to be that voice and representative at my church, being one of the few. I'm the only pastoral staff that's non-white, non-full white at least. And so what I found is just I need to be a lot more intentional about bringing things up and voicing my opinion. And that's hard for us as Asians because we're raised to mind our business. Don't ruffle the feathers. Don't speak up against people in authority or your elders or people that you respect. Like, we're just told to listen and we do what they tell us. Respecting them means not rocking the boat and not having a dissenting voice at all. But what I've found is that as I'm learning to live into what you're saying, Richard, living into my own identity as a biracial Asian American pastor in person in this multi-ethnic context, I do need to speak up more, and I need to be okay if I face opposition sometimes, and that's part of the growing pain. Thankfully, I've found that there's not been strong resistance, but I have found that sometimes there is a little bit of hesitancy, probably because of that reason, because of that lack of moral proximity. More of the leadership who are not Asian are just not attuned and keen to these things. Doesn't mean they don't care. It just means they're not paying attention as much as we are because of our ethnic heritage and our moral proximity.
Yeah. Phyllis, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, everything that Sherin and Clark just said, that's, yeah, pretty accurate. And I think the other thing that I just want to add to that is that, you know, being the only person of color and who happens to also be Asian American on a all white staff, it's hard because like Clark said, I have to be the one who brings up, because I'm always like, do you guys read a different newspaper than I do? Because it
They
sure
do.
feels like it. And I was like, oh, they get I don't know, the white newspaper and I get the Asian. I don't know. Anyway, and it feels like that a lot of times. But also, you know, there's other issues that I think sometimes are more pressing, or they feel is more pressing, and that is kind of more relevant or more at the forefront. And so the focus gets placed on that. And we have to keep speaking up. But something about me that I've noticed as an Asian American, particularly Korean American, is that I'm not one to sit there and keep like being the I think my mother-in-law likes to call it like the squeaky wheel. Like, she's always saying that idiom, and I was like, where does that idiom come from? Because as a Korean, I never grew up with that. And I'm like, she's Korean too. I don't know where she came up with that. But I'm not gonna be a squeaky wheel, because I was always taught you gotta keep your head down and work hard. And when you get recognized, that's when you can say your thing. And part of that is that model minority myth, which I know can open up a whole nother can of worms that I don't know if we have time to get into that tonight. But um, yeah, I just think like being a squeaky wheel is not just in our nature. And also, you do want to respect the people who are, I'm not the senior pastor of the church. But one area that I have noticed that is exciting for me is because I work in Next Gen and I get to work with kids and students. Man, are they ready to go and talk about this stuff?
Oh yeah.
Man, on their Instagram, on their Snapchat, on their TikToks, like it's all over the place. And I was like, oh wow, I'm reading the same news as the kids. And I think that's like kind of the beauty that I get to see. And that's what really gets me excited, is that we have this whole generation who does care about that. And this is just part of their DNA. And that's exciting for me to see. And it's like, okay, how can we shape that and help them so that they are citizens of this, like kingdom citizens of this world that have the perspective of Jesus, but can really see the world as the whole world and not just their context.
Yeah.
So that to me is like really exciting.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Yeah.
Just what you said, Phyllis, just reminded me of like, there's so much temptation to like minimize our stories. And just, I know for you and Clark, you're saying like you're the only kind of person of color on your staffs, but even for me, when I'm not the only person of color, I still find, and again, it's some of that, we've been culturated to kind of blend in, not speak out, all that. And I think the temptation to minimize our stories is just so so large, which is why there could be many, not many, but there's a handful of us that are Asian on the pastoral staff, and we didn't know each other's stories. Like we didn't know anything about our back. I was shocked to find out that one person actually not only was born overseas, but had lived there many years before immigrating. It was shocking to us how little we knew about each other, because in order to serve others, we always minimized our stories. We always minimized ourselves to, and it's part of how we were even raised to think about faith. It's like we minimize ourselves so that we can serve others. And, it's for a long time, having a different story than the other people on staff, whether it was because I was the only person of color or only Asian person or only woman, made me feel self-conscious and made me lean into minimizing myself more and more.
Yeah.
And what I ended up finding out was like, actually, this is my superpower. Just by showing up in the room, in the building, in the pulpit, as me in this body with this voice, it's doing something to push back some of the darkness. It's doing something to push against some of these narratives and assumptions. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say that, because as you were sharing that, and you and Clark were sharing that, I was just like, you know what, that's the struggle, I think, is, we want to minimize our stories. But actually it's our power. It's part of how Christ uses us, is those stories. And so even when it feels challenging, I think it's that much more important that we put them out there.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the moment where the kids that Phyllis teaches would snap, because you're saying such good truth. Yeah, I when the whole George Floyd thing happened, when the racial reckoning stuff happened, I found myself in a very uncomfortable position of speaking out against racial injustice as a very comfortable upper middle class, educated, white, off-white person that exists assimilated in society. It was very uncomfortable for me. And I just remember looking around and seeing, some other, Asian people sort of stumbling through their first foray into the spotlight, speaking out against injustice. And especially as, anti-Asian hate was going on, if I'm being honest, it was a new place for us. It was a new stance for many of us. And I just remember thinking, like, we cannot go away. We have to feel this feeling in our feet and hearing our voice being projected to speak out, because as more and more and more incidents like this happen, like, we will become more and more ready. And so, like, my encouragement to those of you listening is, like, if you feel uncomfortable, you, like Clark, you mentioned this, like, sort of like, I don't know, like, where my place is, what my voice is. I would encourage you to keep leaning into that, because we're figuring this out together in so many ways, and we will just become more and more of consolidated as a voice. And I love AACC because we are get to be a place where that is being developed and shared and platformed for everyone. So I do want to turn to Q&A. So we're gonna probably maybe do this lightning round. I may just call on you, one of you at a time, just to get through as many questions as possible. But first one is, can you talk about the identity crisis or discovery of culture versus in reconciliation with Christ? I'm not sure what that question means, but I think it's talking about this idea of the identity crisis and with, like, how your development with it, and then also this idea of reconciliation with Christ. Sherin, I'm going to go back to you for that one.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think I got it. Dr. Corey Little Edwards talks about this a little bit. She talks about how, culture is defined by people, right? Like by the group, it's a we, right? And we say who we are and the practices and values that define us. Same thing with ethnicity, right? We, as a group, it's a we thing, right? We define ourselves by language or by some physical traits and things like that. But race is like externally exposed on people, right? It's other people imposing judgments just based on external qualities, and it's imposed on people. It's not necessarily defined by that group. And so a lot of times that framework has really helped me, because I can still hold on to my culture and ethnicity. So I can say, like, you know, I'm Indian and there's certain shared cultural things with other Indian people. I'm Malayali, so that particular subset of language and ethnicity within India is, you know, I share certain things with other Malayali people, and I can lean into that, but I can still, and I can share things with other Asian people in terms of values, but that doesn't exclude reconciliation in Christ, right? It's really race that does that. It sort of creates a hierarchy just inherent with the way race has been developed and used, right? It's sort of, that's the thing that really runs counter to reconciliation. And so I think a lot of times it's easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater and be like, well, I have to minimize my culture or minimize my ethnicity in order to move towards reconciliation in Christ. But it's like, we can actually hold on to those things. You know, ethnicity, you know, God has given different ethnicities and languages. And so we can hold on to that and still work towards unity in Christ. But what we have to move more and more away from is these racial constructs. And so I think just even separating those concepts and saying, you know, I'm moving away from the oversimplification of race and the assumptions that come with that, and moving towards, you know, being able to make peace with my own ethnicity, my own cultural identity, with what that means for me, but that doesn't exclude unity in Christ. And so I'm hoping that that's sort of hitting the question that's there is, you know, can we hold on to those things? I think so, and still be moving towards reconciliation in Christ and unity.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Sherin.
Can I,
Phyllis, I want to go ahead,
sorry,
Clark.
if I could just jump on.
Yeah.
So I saw a clarification on the question in the chat. Leonie saying, share your cultural identity in a few words versus your identity in Christ. And that's something that, you know, if I could just briefly share, like, that's been my life story, being biracial. Like, who the heck am I? Like, am I white? I'm not. I adhere, like, people think I'm white, but I don't really jive with the white side of my family fully, because I'm Asian too, but I'm never fully accepted in the Asian spaces because I have a white face. And so my life story has been this journey of asking the question, how does my cultural identity interact with my faith? I think the white majority church will often tell us this narrative of, like, well, you're just who you are in the gospel. Like, that's your identity. You're a Christian first and foremost. Everything else is secondary. And as, you know, altruistic as that sounds, it sounds great, but really at the end of the day, it's kind of naive, because even when we think about the gospel itself, Jesus coming in flesh into history and time, he came into a cultural context. He died in a cultural form. He preached in a way that met a cultural heart, language, and feeling. And so I don't think you can separate culture and faith from each other. Faith is always contextual. The gospel is always contextual. That's what makes the Christian faith so unique. It's not meant to be a colonizing force. It's meant to be one that takes on different shapes as it moves and flows throughout culture and history. And so I think part of our struggle then is to ask the question, well, what does the gospel embodied in my culture, time, and place look like, without straying so far into syncretistic practices that it's indistinguishable from Christianity, but also in a way where it's unique, where it speaks my language, you know, it reaches my heart. And I think that's where we have to really do this difficult work. It's a lifelong work, right? Of saying, what does it look like now for me to express the gospel in my heart, culture, and language? How do I not just, you know, take on what other people tell me my faith is supposed to look like from a maybe white Western colonized lens, but also how do I appreciate the history that's come with that? How do I appreciate the church history and theology that's been passed down? And so that's just what I would say to all of us who are learning that. You know, I think I'm still learning this and growing into this in a multi-ethnic space. All theology is contextual. There's no such thing as a cultural theology. And so that means every theology we're forming has cultural garbs, which means there's always going to be an interplay with faith and culture with that.
Yeah, that's so good, Clark. Thank you. I'm going to turn to our last question and just give each of the panelists just a final sort of word. It's one of the questions that was submitted here, which is, what do you wish non-Asian Christians knew about Asian American Christians in their churches? Phyllis, let's go with you first.
Darn it, I think you're gonna pick somebody else because I was like, oh, I have to think about that one. What do I wish non-Asian Christians knew about Asian Christians? I think that I think in my church context, what I wish that they knew is that they could somehow understand that a communal identity is really important to me, um, and that it just goes beyond just a community that meets on once a week, like let's say, but that it's I, I don't know, like we give each other money, we like make sure everyone is fed, we kind of do all this thing. So the word we is like huge for me, and I think for Asian Americans in general,
Yeah.
particularly for Korean Americans. And the other thing is that I really want, this sounds really weird because I grew up with this and thinking this was weird, but there's something about praying out loud together that Korean, like, it doesn't have to be 6 in the morning, but praying out loud together, like hearing each other's voices and just that being lifted up to God, is something that's just really powerful, and I think helps us to shed uh our individual just relationship, but to remind us of that it is not just me and God, but it's
Yeah.
also us and God.
Yeah.
So I think those are the two big things
Yeah.
probably.
You missed it in the chat, but Priscilla actually said community as you said the word community.
Oh
So
yeah,
it was like exactly perfectly
Priscilla.
timed.
Hmm.
Clark, how about you? Real quick.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what Phyllis said resonates with me too. I think the first thing I'd say is most of us are probably, if we are in non-Asian spaces here, every person from every culture has something to shed light on the gospel. And I've just kind of learned that as I've had to code switch a little bit, but also as I've moved around to different types of Asian and non-Asian churches. Every culture has things inherently that are highly idolatrous and sinful that we need to combat with the truth of the scriptures, but every culture brings something to light that another culture is weak in. Korean prayer is one of those. I learned that in the Korean church, how to pray. Like the Korean church taught me how to pray. The Chinese church taught me about service and sacrifice. And so I think just humbly asking, like, what does this other person, as much as there's things I'm frustrated about, how much can they teach me about my faith that I don't know yet? Because I haven't interacted enough with that culture and the being made in the image of God, the things that are inherent by common grace in God's creation there. I think the other thing too that I've always had to remind white leaders in the spaces I'm in is that just because we're silent doesn't mean we have nothing to say. And our culture often, as Asians, leads us to be silent because that's a form of respect, actually, is to wait to speak until it's our turn. I think unfortunately a lot of white leaders perceive that as we're non-compliant, like we're not participating. But really that's a sign of respect. And if you want to value us and hear our voice, like maybe ask us personally, call on us. That's something I've had to learn. I'm in youth ministry still too, like Phyllis. I've had to learn, like when I ask an open-ended question, a lot of times I just got to call on some of the Asian kids or I'm not going to hear from them.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing. It's just, it's learning how to do pedagogy in a cultural context.
Yeah.
And so that's what I've always had to remind white church leaders.
Yeah.
And even just to tell them that, like, sometimes our silence, it's a way of service because, I think Sherin was saying this, like, as much as we don't embrace our stories, that's something we need to learn to lean into more. But I think that's also something that we can bring to the table that Asians have found, not all Asians, but a lot of Asians are good listeners because we don't talk about ourselves. And even that can be a good thing to help other people bring their stories out, even if it means we're sacrificing a little bit of our own ability to share. What's more gospel than that, right? Sacrificing our own selves so others may be brought to light. So
yeah. Thank you, Clark. Sherin, take us home.
Yeah, I mean, just a lot of what was already said. And one thing I could probably add to what's already been shared is, just be curious about us. Like, don't maybe make assumptions because you met one other Indian person or one other Korean person, or you attended a a dinner or a wedding, or, I think sometimes that can be the hardest thing, is like you already have an impression in your mind about us culturally, or about what we bring. Yeah, there's a lot of Asian women that are more, they're quieter and they're less likely to be forthright, but the Indian women in my family are very loud and boisterous and have strong opinions and offer them fairly freely. And so, there's just like any culture or people group, there's a wide variety. And so curiosity about others is so such an important thing to cultivate. And so just, ask us about our stories and be willing to hear them on our terms. And maybe don't be so quick to jump to like how you connect with that, or the person, that's also Indian, or, just listen and be curious and ask questions. Hospitality is a big value across Asian cultures. And, we tend to offer that, as Clark said, we tend to offer that to others. And we'd love the chance to receive it as well. Just the hospitality of hosting our stories and hearing them given on our own terms.
Yeah, that's great. What I'm hearing from all of you is you want people to ask and you want people to listen. And I think those are two different things, but they go side by side and are very vital. I just want to thank our panelists for the time today. But I also want to just let all of our audience know, and those of you watching the recording, this is a series of webinars. So we're going to have some webinars coming from time to time. And we do this content at AACC from time to time. And so please do follow us on social. You'll be able to get updates as to what is coming up and the conversations that are happening. And also, we are planning our first conference in March of 2023. And so you definitely want to stay tuned and follow us to be able to find out about that. And you can probably see Sherin, Clark, or Phyllis there and buy them a drink. Anyway, I'm just grateful for the time, grateful for all our panelists, and just for the conversation that we've had, and for the vulnerability and the great interaction and questions in the chat as well. Thank you guys so much. And it is great to be with you. And thank you so much for joining us.